Now, these last two papers are going to look at kind of the afterlife of some of the imperial glories that we've been through. Our first speaker is Professor Olga M. Davidson. She is currently on the faculty of the Institute for the Study of Muslim Societies and Civilizations at Boston University, where she has served as a research fellow since 2009. From 1992 to 97, she was chair of the concentration in Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at Brandeis. Since 1999, she has been chairperson of the board of the ILEX Foundation, and she is the author of Poet and Hero in the Persian Book of Kings. And she also has written comparative literature and classical Persian poetry, and co-edited Ferdowsi's Shāhnāme, Millennial Perspectives. So it is with pleasure that I introduce Professor Davidson, who will speak on how the Persian Book of Kings by Ferdowsi about the ancient royal dynasties of Iran could ever become a world epic for the so-called West. Professor Davidson.
Thank you, Professor Carter, for such an elegant introduction. Thank you, Rahim and Jeff and Marissa, for arranging a really awesome conference. And I'm now going to just jet ahead to the Middle Ages and very much the present. Rum and Rome, how the Persian Book of Kings by Ferdowsi about the ancient royal dynasties of Iran could ever become a world epic for the so-called West. The lengthy process of composing the poem, known as the Shāhnāme, meaning the Book of Kings in Persian languages like Farsi, spoken mostly today in today's Iran, and Dari, spoken mostly in today's Afghanistan, was completed in the early 11th century CE. The poet who composed this monumental work of poetry, over 50,000 couplets, that is double-versed, in length, was Abu Qasim Ferdowsi Tusi, whose pen name Ferdowsi means the man of paradise in Persianate languages. As this poet's retrospective pen name implies, the Book of Kings became over time what is commonly described as the national epic of populations who speak Persian or Persianate languages and who think of their cultural ancestry as Iranian. And, as we shall see, the Shāhnāme of Ferdowsi eventually became even a world epic. But the term world epic seems hardly appropriate when we consider the historical origins of this monumental poem, despite its exalted reception through the ages in a wide variety of Persianate societies that identified with their Iranian heritage by way of venerating a form of poetry that glorifies the ancient royal dynasties of Iran. The term epic becomes relevant when we consider how such an exalted reception of poetry extended to non-Persianate and even to non-Iranian worlds, including what is known as the West writ large. In part one of my presentation, I will consider briefly the reception of the Shāhnāme in the so-called West. But then in part two, I will go further by considering how the poetry of Ferdowsi himself anticipates its own reception not only in the Iranian world, but even in the world of the West, as pictured in the Shāhnāme. To make this point, I will focus on what is narrated in the Shāhnāme about a shah named Goshtāsp, who, before he becomes king, emigrates to the capital city of the West, that is to Rum, known as the West, as Byzantium, when he tests his potential for kingship by undertaking various heroic tasks. Most relevant here is my use of the word heroic in describing the task performed by Goshtāsp in Rum, since part one of my argumentation centers on the historical reception of Ferdowsi in the real West, that was Europe in later times. For Europeans, the reception of the Shāhnāme was inspired by narratives not only about kings as kings, but about kings as heroes and about heroes as kingmakers. There is an irony here that is relevant in my argument, since Rum, as Byzantium is for Westerners, an equivalent of Eastern version of Rome in the real West. Elaborating on this irony, I will follow up in part 2 of my two-part presentation by shifting from the standpoint of the West to the standpoint of the East, as expressed in the Shāhnāme itself. Whereas part one concerns how the West looks at the Shāhnāme, part 2 will concern how the Shāhnāme looks at the West. That is, how the poetry of Ferdowsi views Rum as the center point of the West. In the West, the Persian Book of Kings by the poet Ferdowsi is not only an epic, not only a national epic, but a world epic as well. In English-speaking North America, for example, this work of poetry can be read with ease and even with delight in such educational settings as college-level survey courses, where students are assigned the most representative samples of the poetry, rendered in the best available English translations. But why is this monumental poem known as an epic? Our first impression is that the answer must be complicated, since the Shāhnāme presents itself as a book, yes, literally as a book, about kings. It tells about the reigns of all the national shahs of Iran, from primordial founders of the social order in the world of myth, all the way down to the realities of history, terminating with the last years of the Sasanian dynasty, which came to a bitter end in 651 CE, when the empire that was then ruled by this dynasty, we conceive it retrospectively as the Iranian empire, ruled by a Zoroastrian king of kings, was finally overpowered by a new empire that was non-Iranian and alien to the state religion nominally, stemming from its prototypical founder, Zoroaster. In this new empire, known to historians as the Caliphate, represented by Arab civilization, Muslim Arab civilization. So what does a purportedly complete story about the kings of Iranian empire start all the way from the myths about primordial beginnings have to do with epic, as this word is understood in the West? With this question in mind, I propose now to take a second look at the Shāhnāme of Ferdowsi, where I propose we can find an answer to this question, a simple answer. The answer, simple though it may be in the long run, requires some clarification about what we mean when we say epic. There are 3 facts to consider here. First, to start with the most obvious, the monumentality of this composition produced by Ferdowsi is truly of epic proportions. For example, the length of the Book of Kings, with its over 50,000 couplets, as already noted, far exceeds the number of verses we read in the 2 ancient Greek epics known as the Homeric Iliad and Odyssey, the lengths of which exceed no more than 15,000 and around 12,000 lines, respectively. Second, the Book of Kings surely glorified Iranian civilization, just as, say, the 2 epics of Homer glorified Greek civilization. And these 2 facts need to be supplemented by a third fact, which is most decisive. The Book of Kings glorified not only kings, but also heroes. And the greatest of all Iranian heroes, named Rustam, is eminently comparable to the greatest heroes in other epics, such as Achilles in the Homeric Iliad. One such hero as epic hero is factored into definitions of epic. The Shāhnāme of Ferdowsi becomes readily comparable to world epics such as the Homeric Iliad. In terms of Greco-Roman comparative models of epic, the Shāhnāme can be seen as an epic in its own right, and as a world epic at that. In other words, the Book of Kings by Ferdowsi fits the criteria of various working definitions of world epics as viewed from classical perspective. Here is one definition. Epic is an expansive poem of enormous scope, composed in old-fashioned and superbly elevated style of language concerning the wondrous deeds of heroes. But the question remains, what do heroes have to do with kings? In the case of the Shāhnāme, what do stories about kings have to do with stories about heroes? Here again, it is helpful to apply classical perspective. The fact is, epics about heroes are a kind of court poetry meant for kings or for lower-level potentates, whom we may describe as would-be kings. A telling illustration of this fact is evident in the comparative cross-cultural evidence about the reception of epics in traditional societies. A classical example of the veneration of Calliope, the muse of epic in ancient Greek song culture, and the muse of kings as declared in the Hesiotic Theogony, where it is made clear that even popular reception depends on royal patronage. Thus, stories about heroes depend on kings, and we can therefore expect that these stories to interweave with stories about kings themselves. In the case of the Persian Shāhnāme, therefore, this book of Kings is an ideal context for telling stories about heroes, which are epic stories. How then could Persian epic traditions survive when the Zoroastrian worldview of the last Iranian empire had been forced to give way to a Muslim worldview after the Sasanian dynasty was overpowered by the Arab conquest? For centuries, such traditions as exemplified by Persian court poetry went underground, as it were, but the cultural grip of the Arabic language as the elite mode of communication was loosened in the era known as the Second Caliphate, or the so-called Abbasid period. And there followed a resurgence of Persianate languages and culture. The new world of Persian was predominantly Muslim, no longer Zoroastrian, with the language of the Persians now being written in a script derived directly from the writing system of the Muslim Arab conquerors. And this system persists to our own times, but the language was still Persian, which linguists describe as Indo-European in derivation, to be contrasted with Arabic, which is a Semitic language remotely akin to Hebrew. It is in this social context, especially in the eastern reaches of the Iranian world, as in the region of Khorasan, homeland of Ferdowsi himself, that a new wave of epic song culture took hold. Ferdowsi the poet can be viewed as an integral part of this culture, and his poetic medium was a form of ornate epic language that could be traced back to early phases of Iranian languages, including not only Middle Persian of the Sasanian dynasty, but even Parthian, the lingua franca of an even earlier dynasty. For those today who do not read Arabic or Persian, which are both written in the Arabic script, the printed version of the Shāhnāme could easily be mistaken for Arabic texts. But the Persian language underlying the script of the Book of Kings is remarkably free from Arabic words, though the ordinary Persian language had already for centuries absorbed massive infusions of Arabic vocabulary. Even in our times, it would be unthinkable for Persians to write or read their language in any other script than the Arabic-derived system that had been used ever since the Arab conquest. Accordingly, the script of choice for standard editions of the Persian Book of Kings needs to follow the Arabic-derived system of writing. In the poetic diction of Ferdowsi, however, it is as if the Zoroastrian world of the Iranian Empire had never been occluded. God, for example, is not Allah, but Persian Khoda. Divinity is still not European, as it were, not Semitic, and the worldview is distinctly Zoroastrian, not Muslim, though the world of Persians, was by now predominantly Muslim. The adaptability of this epic form to the Muslim world extended even further. Although the patronage systems of the East Iran during the life and times of Ferdowsi were predominantly Sunni, as exemplified especially by Mahmud of Ghazna, the royal potentate who was the main patron of Ferdowsi during the poet's lifetime, the subsequent reception of this poet's Shāhnāme as a preeminent form of court poetry in later centuries, dominated by later dynasties, tended to be Shiite. A striking example of this latter kind of patronage was a lavish new recension of the Shāhnāme that was commissioned in 1426 CE and published in 1430 under the aegis of a prince named Baysangur. The preface, which was likewise commissioned by the prince, tells of the story of the poet and of his poetry. Such a story can be mined by literary historians as a source for reconstructing the reception of the Shāhnāme, not only in the era of Ferdowsi, but also in later times, culminating in an era of Baysangur. From the standpoint of the preface, I argue the reception of the Shāhnāme can be described in modern literary critical terms as a model of globalism. But the globalism of the Shāhnāme in the court of a prince like Byzantium in the 15th century CE was still to be seen in terms of empire, an Iranian empire that glorified itself by way of the Book of Kings, that recorded a form of court poetry that transcended regionalism, but was global only in terms of addressing the political and cultural diversity of an imperial project. So, how did this imperial project evolve into a truly worldwide project? Such an evolution is still noted in the realia of royalty, but the royalism eventually faded in the light of the exceptional merits of the poetry itself, even in translation. It started with the publication sponsored by a French government that had reverted to royalism in the French post-revolution of the Shāhnāme in a new edition, together with the most accomplished French translation on the part of its editor, Jules Moll, who was a learned expert in the Persian poetic language of Ferdowsi. This edition by Moll, in 7 volumes, is the key to the reception of the Shāhnāme as world literature. The story is well told by Reza Tahir Kermani, whose article I recommend as an introduction to the study of the Shāhnāme as world literature. After a reading of this article, I would further recommend the reading of a poem by Matthew Arnold in 1853, Sohrab and Rustum, R-U-S-T-U-M, that's how he spells it, 892 lines long, 892 lines long, which was inspired by a paraphrase by Charles-Augustin Sainte-Beuve, 1850, of the most celebrated episode of the Shāhnāme, recounting a tragic duel to the death between the hero Rustam and his unrecognized son Sohrab. I also recommend reading this episode as most deftly translated by Dick Davis. The article by Tahir Kermani provides a helpful tracking of the relevant portions of this translation by Davis, placed side by side with the corresponding paraphrases of Sainte-Beuve, translated from the original French into English. As for analyzing the lament of Takhmina, mother of Sohrab, over the death of her son fathered by Rustam, I recommend my own translation and analysis, where I argue that the poetry here is a shining example of an oft-neglected genre of Iranian song culture, women's lament. The learned correspondence between Arnold and Sainte-Beuve, which led to Arnold's epic-style composition of Sohrab and Rustam, can be analyzed in the light of essays by these two literary figures on classicism as a point of comparison in appreciating the universal appeal of the Shāhnāme as epic poetry. In the Shāhnāme of Ferdowsi, we read about an old Iranian dynasty called Qayani in Persian. Experts who studied the evolution of Iranian traditions extended from the earliest attested texts in the Avesta all the way down to the classical Persian poetry of Ferdowsi and beyond, refer to the kings of this dynasty simply as the Qayanids. The Persian form Qayani is derived ultimately from a noun attested as kawi in the Vestan, related to the noun kavi. Related to the Indic noun kavi, which can be interpreted as priest or more generally seer or sage. In the Avesta, the noun kawi is applied to a title to kings in the Qayyanid dynasty line of succession. I focus here on one particular king in this dynastic arrangement. He is Goshtāsp, whose name becomes Goshtāsp in the Persian Shāhnāme. In an article I originally published over a third century ago, yeah, I'm a little old, I studied the role of this king Goshtāsp in a narrative of the Shāhnāme by analyzing convergences and divergences between his role and the role of his father, the previous king of this same narrative, whose name was Lohrasp in Persian, to be derived from the name Arwataspa as attested in the Avesta. In more recent works, I have revised my approach in studying the relationship of Goshtāsp to his father, Goshtāsp, by applying the anthropological approaches of Nicholas Allen regarding what he describes as the pendatic relationships in myth. As we will see, my revision has resulted in a new way of looking at the narratives of Ferdowsi about, the sojourn of Goshtāsp before he became the Shah of Iran in the capital city of the West, which would be called Rum from the standpoint of early phases in the evolution of Iranian poetic traditions. In my earlier study, I was building on theories developed by an article by Stig Vikander, and subsequently in a book by Georges Dumézil, with references to narratives we find in the Shāhnāme about King Goshtāsp and about his father, King Lohrasp. In that study of mine, I had persuaded the idea that both of these kings, father and son together, represented the third function. I'm using here a special terminology devised by Dumézil in his modeling of three social functions or ideologies prevalent in languages belonging to what is known as the Indo-European linguistic family. In terms of Dumézil's model of trifunctionalism, a model followed by Vikander, the three functions correspond to the social roles of 1, priests, 2, warriors, and 3, producers. In the terms of this model, the Iranian pair of Lohrasp and Goshtāsp, father and son, is comparable in function with the Indic pair of brother and brother, twin heroes Nakula and Sahadeva, who are featured prominently in the great Sanskrit epic known as the Mahabharata. In the narrative of that epic, these two twin heroes were fathered by twin gods named the Ashvins, who represented the third function of productivity in the Indic pantheon, as Vikander and Dumézil argue persuasively. There is a major problem, however, in comparing the Iranian pair Goshtāsp and Lohrasp with the Indic pair Nakula and Sahadeva. If we follow Dumézil's model of trifunctionality, the Iranian pair must belong primarily to the first function. That is to say, Lohrasp and Goshtāsp are priestly by virtue of their status as Kayanids, since even the name of that dynasty signals membership in a priestly class, as it were. Moreover, again in terms of Dumézil's model, the role of Lohrasp and Goshtāsp as kings should be seen as a confirmation of their membership in the first function. As Dumézil argues, sovereignty is a defining aspect of the priestliness that characterizes figures belonging to the first function in myth. So, to restate the problem, I ask this question: how can we justify the idea that the Iranian pair of Goshtāsp and Lohrasp are cognate with the Indic pair of Nakula and Sahadeva in terms of shared Indo-Iranian and ultimately Indo-European mythological traditions? How can one pair belong to the first function if the other pair belongs to the third? This problem is especially acute in the case of the Iranian figure Goshtāsp, since the myths in which he's primarily involved with seem to contradict, as we will see, the very idea that he should belong to the third function. The problem is solved, however, if we apply the pedantic model developed by Nick Allen, which can serve as a refinement of the trifunctional model developed by Dumézil and Vikander. Allen's thinking about the institution of kingship in general is especially pertinent to the role of Goshtāsp as king belonging to the dynasty of the Kayanids. As Allen argues, the very idea of kingship or sovereignty, which Dumézil has tied to the first function, fits not only the priestly aspect of the first function as formulated by Dumézil, it also fits two other of the three functions. That is the role of king as transcendent. Kingship transcends all three functions as represented by 1, priests, 2, warriors, 3, producers. To use Allen's terminology in referring to these three functions, F1, F2, F3, there is a fourth function that transcends the other three, and Allen's way of referring to this fourth function of transcendence is F4+. In terms of Alec pedantic model, then kingship belongs to the category of F4+. And to round out Allen's pedantic model, there is also a fifth function, Allen's F4-, which stands for the negative aspect of any one of the three functions, F1, F2, F3. As I argue, the figure of Goshtāsp represents not only the transcendent function that Allen labels as F4+, but also the negative function that Allen labels as F4-, since this Iranian figure exhibits negative as well as positive aspects of Dumézil's three functions, abbreviated as F1, F2, F3, by Allen, which are the functions of priests, warriors, and producers. Applying then Allen's pedantic model, I now argue that the role of Goshtāsp in the Shāhnāme is variable that can be relocated from F1 to F2 to F3 by way of transcendence, F4+, but also by way of negativity, F4-. In making my argument, I rethink what I argue in my earlier work by reformulating my arguments in terms of Nick Allen's F1, F2, F3, F4+, F4-. My reformulations, what follows, will trace Allen's pedantic classifications. In the case of Lochrasp and Goshtāsp, Vikander analyzes a variety of twin-like parallelisms shared by this pair of kings. For example, the names both feature the shared element of asp, which can be derived from the Avestan form aspa, meaning horse, cognate with Indic ashva, also meaning horse, which is derived the Indic dual from Ashvinau, the name of the Indic divine twins. Relevant to is the observation of Vikander that Lochrasp and Goshtāsp are exceptional in sharing the element asp in their names. We may compare such an onomastic parallelism with what we find in Old English traditions about the young twin brothers Hengist and Horsa, who, according to Bede, were said to be descended from the god Odin and was reported to have led the Saxons to their invasion of the British Isles, thus saving people from overpopulation and famine. In noting that Lochras is but a pale, impersonal, and inactive doublet of Goshtāsp, Vikander assumes that this description fits because Lochras was originally just a twin of Goshtāsp, parallel in every way. My point of contrast is that the description of the twin fits also because Lochrasp was the passive member of a simultaneously divergent and convergent pair, while Goshtāsp was the active member we can find in point of comparison in the Old English. The page's names, Hengist and Horsa, mentioned earlier. The name Hengist, who turns out to be the more aggressive brother, means stallion or steed, as in the German Hengst, while the name, the more passive Horsa, means simply horse, or as in English horse. So these two names convey divergences as well as convergences. Whereas both names converge as meaning horse, they diverge in that the name indicates war horse, but the second, just a horse, farm horse. Moreover, I propose that the symbolism of a simultaneously divergent and convergent pair does not require that the relationship between the pair be that of twin brother or twin brother. The same sort of symbolism could also be expressed in the relationship of father and son. I conclude with a brief retelling of such a relationship between the kings Lochrasp and Goshtāsp in the Shāhnāme, drawing on my earlier analysis, but this time I add to my retelling the categories of Allen's pedantic taxonomy. Lochrasp, once he has ascended the throne, proclaims that his reign as king will be marked by the rejection of aggressiveness and the promotion of peace, F3 with reference to F2. In fact, Lochrasp is so opposed to aggression and war that he prefers to hand down the crown to successors other than his own rash son, Goshtāsp. Let's give him a F4- with a reference to F2. This preference, of course, angers Goshtāsp to the point where he demands of his father that Lochrasp should relinquish the throne and pass it down to him. Lochrasp refuses because he's opposed to the violence of Goshtāsp. Goshtāsp, enraged at his father for not agreeing, then leaves Iran and goes into self-appointed exile in Byzantium, that is, Rome. When Goshtāsp first comes to Rome, he has great difficulty getting any sort of gainful employment, F3, because of his belligerent nature and excessive strength. This is one of my favorite parts because he tries to become a scribe and he breaks the pen, and he tries to be a blacksmith and he hammers and, fire goes all over the place, the hammer breaks, the iron breaks. The only tasks he's able to undertake successfully in Rome are hunting, fighting monstrous beasts, and winning the brides for less heroic men. Hence, Goshtāsp was taken on the role of an overly aggressive and overly warlike hero. From the standpoint of Western heroic standards, then he becomes a parody of the Western hero. Goshtāsp finally comes back to Iran after several adventures and does take over the throne, leaving a little corner for his father to rule, F3. He remains aggressive, F2, until his father dies, and then he loses his aggressiveness, F2. As the new king, he performs the ultimate priestly function, F1, of converting the warrior hero Zal and his son Rostam, F2, to the religion of Zoroaster, while his son of Goshtāsp, Prince Esfandiar, converts the rest of Iran. But the priestly function of Goshtāsp can also be negative, F4-, with respect to F1, since he is blamed for the death of his son Esfandiar, paragon of Zoroastrianism, at the hands of the warrior hero Rustam. If we apply the pedantic model devised by Nick Allen to the figure of Goshtāsp as portrayed in the Shāhnāme, we find that the figure fits all 5 functions of such a model. Goshtāsp fits F1, F2, F3, thus transcending the first 3 functions, F+, and can also be transcendently negative as well as positive, example at all 3 F-. If we apply, on the other hand, an Eastern model of the epic hero, we can also say that Goshtāsp, in the Rome of the West, is overly Western. So his figure simply does not fit the Eastern model as best exemplified by Rostam in the Shāhnāme of Ferdowsi. Nor does he fit the Western model of the epic hero, since in the end he switches from the role of a hero to the role of a king, and hardly an admirable king at that. After all, Goshtāsp becomes responsible for the death of his own son Esfandiar in that prince's role as an admired hero who rivals Rustam as a hero himself. Thank you. I'm sorry, I just have one small factoid which I think applies to this conference. On the Boston Library, public library, which was built in 1895, and the architect I think is McKim, there are something like 1,000 names of famous philosophers and writers and poets, etc., on the facade. And on one part, there's a little block, and it has Ferdowsi, Plato, Theodorus, and Spinoza together. I thought you'd like to know that.